Well, we want to be mindful of everyone's time, and so we're going to get started with our presentation today, Managing Mixed Age Teams. Please note that this session is being recorded and we'll share out via the email that you registered for later this week. And we will have time for question and answer later in the session, so please get ready for those. You should have a Q&A button at the bottom of your Zoom webinar screen that looks like what you see here. That's your way to ask questions. We ask that folks use the Q&A to ask questions versus the chat, because that helps us track it a little bit more. And so now, without further ado, it's my pleasure to introduce Heather Tinsley-Fix, Senior Advisor at AARP, to begin today's presentation. Heather, over to you.
Hi, everyone. So good to have you with us. Thank you for joining us for our webinar on managing mixed age teams. I'm really excited to welcome Megan Gerhardt, author of Gentelligence, a revolutionary way of managing the intergenerational workforce. She's with us today, and I'm really excited to get into some conversation with her later. But I wanted to first kick off by introducing why we decided to talk about this topic, and why managing mixed age teams is something we think we think you can benefit from. We wanted to we created a guide called Managing Mixed Age Teams, and that's kind of what we're launching with our webinar here today. But I wanted to open with a quote from Johnny Taylor, the CEO of SHRM, because I think it's a really evocative quote, and I think it's certainly one that resonates with people as soon as they hear it, and that is that there is no relationship in the workplace more powerful than the one between people managers and employees. And I know that this sort of struck me as soon as I read it. I would imagine that, and I'd love to see responses to this in the chat, the degree to which people feel have resonated with this before, in that when their manager retires or leaves and you're going to get a new manager, the talk around the water cooler and in your teams is usually, oh, what kind of manager are we going to get? Hopefully it's going to be someone that we can work with, that is supportive of us and that elevates our work throughout the organization. I know this has happened to me a couple of times working here at AARP, and I've been really lucky to have great managers, but it's certainly something that impacts our satisfaction at work, our engagement at work, and also our ability or interest in staying. It's a huge factor in retention. The other thing about mixed age teams that I wanted to mention is that there's a lot of benefit that organizations can derive from the multi-generational workforce. Right now, the workforce is more generationally diverse than it has ever been in history. There are as many as 5 generations in the workforce today. And this is as a result of a couple of demographic trends that include the lengthening of our lifespans. In general, our lives are getting longer. We're staying healthier for longer within those lifespans. And we're having children at much lower rates, at least in the United States and a lot of developed countries around the world. The birth rate is dropping and our lifespans are increasing. And so this means that our workforce is age diverse now and likely to be age diverse for many years to come. And that's actually good news for employers who are willing to put the work in to leverage the value that mixed age teams bring. I wanted to mention a couple of them here. The first is that research shows that in inclusive organizations, so organizations that work towards having an inclusive culture, find that mixed age teams increase the productivity of both older workers and younger workers alike. And the theory on this is that age-inclusive teams benefit from the spillover effect that comes from sharing knowledge and perspectives gained across long periods of experience or shorter periods of experience. Your newer team members are coming with newer perspectives or different perspectives, and that helps increase productivity as well as the increased likelihood of innovation. And that's just due to a greater diversity of ideas, knowledge, and skill sets. There are skills that one develops over time in your working life they're often called soft skills or human skills, but these are the kinds of skills that do tend to take time to develop. And so that wealth of sort of skills like leadership, the ability to make judgments, anticipation and avoiding of errors, and just general sort of mentoring and leadership skills are really ones that you can leverage in an age diverse team. And then sort of at the lower end of the spectrum, you've got folks who are coming in with newer skill sets, different skill sets, and have ideas, and they are sort of can be more blue sky, thinking outside the box. And then so you have this wonderful balance and this sharing of perspectives and ideas. There's also another benefit of mixed age teams is that they're resilient in terms of going through times of upheaval and change, which we certainly know a lot about over the last couple of years. One of the things that was really interesting about the pandemic and the different employee surveys and just work that was done by Pew and others, they found it was found in a couple of different surveys that older workers adjusted more easily to working remotely during the pandemic, and just working in general during the pandemic. And the reasons were that older workers, even though they experienced the same levels of stress that younger workers did, they had just adapted to over the course of their life to be able to sort of handle stress better, to deal with it better, to sort of have a long-term perspective that this too shall pass. So certainly at the beginning of the pandemic, we really counseled employers to leverage their older workers as a means of providing counsel and guidance and mentorship during times that are really, at least certainly at the beginning of the pandemic, a lot of upheaval and uncertainty. Lastly, I'll just mention that in terms of the value of age-diverse workforces, you definitely can count on a stronger pipeline of talent if you're really welcoming workers of all ages. Right now, there are, I'm sure you guys know this, there are more open positions in the United States than there are unemployed people to fill them. There's a real worker shortage, and we need to look everywhere for talent to fill our open roles. Being open to a multi-generational workforce provides one of those avenues for looking for additional talent. And certainly, research shows too that older workers have less unexpected turnover, by which I mean there's more you get more of a view into like when they're thinking of leaving. So there's less turnover among older workers for a variety of reasons, but that provides a little more continuity and stability to the workforce, as well as the retention of intellectual capital. So moving into sort of why managers matter, even though there's sort of the basic understanding, like why managers matter is because they have a huge effect on employee engagement, both positive and negative, but also because they're the key drivers of retention in an organization. This statistic really, it didn't surprise me, even though it's quite high. 82% of employees would consider quitting their job because of a bad manager. And again, I welcome your engagement in the chat on this topic. It's sort of something that probably makes us all chuckle because we've probably all had a bad manager at one point in our careers, and it's a huge impact on one's satisfaction at work and their willingness to stay in a job. But I wanted to mention two other things as well. Employees are really reluctant to talk to their managers about age bias concerns. We know from our research, we do survey workers every couple of years on their experience with ageism in the workplace. And 62% of workers we surveyed last year said that they had seen or experienced themselves age discrimination in the workforce, and yet only 3% of employees bring formal complaints about it. We also know that younger workers tend to be highly attuned to bias in the workplace, even if it's not occurring against them. But if it is, if they're feeling that they're being discriminated against because they're too young and they're being passed over for opportunities, they're also less likely to report it because they might know that the Age Discrimination in Employment Act, which is the federal level age discrimination protection legislation, protects workers over the age of 40. Now, this is not true actually in many states. There is no age limit up or down, but younger workers may not mention it because they may feel like, well, they don't sort of deserve to mention it, or they don't have that protection. And again, any sort of, if you're not talking about the bias that you're experiencing in your role with your manager, let alone the wider organization, then you're more likely to leave. The last thing I want to say too about managers is that they're really the lifeblood of the organization, and they can make or break your DEI goals. Either you empower them to support your DEI work, or they're going to ignore them, or they might ignore them within their own team practices and culture. And age is, and I know Megan will get into this a little bit when you're going through your slides and in our conversation, but age is a unique aspect of diversity that is actually one everyone shares. It intersects with all other forms of identity. And I wanted to mention, in the realm of ageism or age discrimination, I wanted to mention one way, an example of how this intersects with gender discrimination. So I came across this article in September of this year that talked about the experience of a woman named Nicole Cherie Hannah Jones. She's the Pulitzer Prize winning author behind the 1619 Project. And she discovered this tweet in her Twitter feed one day, and sort of kicked off a Twitter firestorm over this depiction of women. This is from a company called Better Me. They're an online health and wellness enterprise, and they do issue all kinds of walking challenges, good healthy eating challenges, etc. But anyway, they have this walking challenge that they tweeted out for women over the age of 45, in which they encouraged women of this age to ease into walking programs and incorporate multiple rest days so they wouldn't be taxed. And so there was quite a lot of discussion about this in terms of representation of women. You can see here that there's like sort of a couple age groupings, 45 to 50, 50 to 55, and so on. And then the link for this this walking program, or what Better Me was sort of promoting, took them to a landing page where there were also similar campaigns or images for the depiction of men in the same sort of age groups. And a dramatic pause, it would be really interesting to see how you think the men were represented in this 28-day walking challenge. And here's how the men were represented. So, there's a big disconnect and a big difference. Now, this is, this is a fitness and wellness organization. It's not necessarily universal, but, the images we see in the media subconsciously influence our opinions of ourselves and others based on age. And you can see the men 45 to 65 in this group right here are a far cry from the way that women are depicted. So, and this actually correlates to research that shows that women experience ageism earlier and more intensely than men do. There's more impact to their ability to compete for jobs when they're looking for work or looking to change careers. So this is an example of how age intersects with other aspects of diversity. The last thing I wanted to touch on real quick here before I introduce our guide and then hand it over to Megan is that the way that we think about ourselves is kind of once we sort of become young adults, sort of 20 to 25 years old, when we've really formed our identity, we're out in the world, making our way, this understanding of ourselves or this image of ourselves doesn't really change after that. We do change as people, we gain new experiences, we definitely change, but our sort of inner core of our sense of self doesn't change. And I mention this because it's something that you may have witnessed in your own friendships, either at work or personally, that you can be friends with someone who's 20 years older than you are or 20 years younger than you are. And when you're connecting on a personal level, say on a work project or on a shared interest, age sort of falls away. It disappears as an aspect of your sort of interacting with that person. And so I mention this because I think this is true too about other aspects of identity and that the road to inclusion is to sort of see this person at the center of their identity without these aspects, or at least not using those sort of external aspects to limit. It's when you bring this inner self to work, this sort of core identity, that you feel truly included, that you feel engaged, and that you are performing at your highest level for your organizations. I'm going to turn it over to Megan now to go through her slides. But just quickly, I want to mention our guide. You can find this if you go to aarp.org/employers. We have this new guide that you can download, and it presents the case for why mixed age teams are good for business, good for your organization, how you can leverage them, and then includes lots of training exercises and activities for your managers, for your people managers. So we'll drop the link in the chat for that as well, but feel free to go to our Employer Resource Center, where you can find all sorts of resources to help you become more age-inclusive organizations. So Megan, take it away.
All right, thank you, Heather. Hello, everyone. So I'm excited to be here today to share my work on something that is quite aligned with the work of AARP. So I was thrilled to see really the overlap in the way that we're all collectively thinking about the potential of this. So I'm here to talk about my work on Gentelligence, which is a term you probably have not heard before, but now we're going to change that, and I'll get to the definition in just a second. But specifically for our purposes today, Gentelligent teams. So as Heather referenced, we have a real opportunity here because we know that only 6% of organizations really believe that although we have a multi-generational workforce and multi-age workforce, that very few organizations really know what to do with it. At best, I think we're trying to do some damage control, trying to make sure that age differences don't cause conflict or tension, but definitely not tapping into what are truly opportunities sitting in that kind of diversity of experience and thought in a way that we could be. And so that is the focus of the work that I do. I want to give you a quick definition of the term Gentelligence. So it's a term I came up with a little over 5 years ago. It speaks to this concept that there is a collective intelligence possible if we take the fact that different ages and different generations in the workplace have, as Heather referenced, different kinds of knowledge and expertise. That growing up at a particular period of time is just one layer of who we are, and that very big concept of identity, but that we learn different inherent skills depending on when we started our careers and what we needed in order to navigate that world of work, but also our experiences in different kinds of areas and how that can create really fantastic innovation. It can create productivity and learning if we allow ourselves to look at it that way. So Gentelligence is really about seeing our multi-generational and multi-age workforce as an opportunity instead of a threat, and tapping into the fact that all ages have something to teach and something to learn. So I'm here today to talk about what was actually our favorite chapter in our book to write. So we wrote a book called Gentelligence, The Revolutionary Approach to Leading an Intergenerational Workforce that came out last year. We had an article in Harvard Business Review this past March featured as the big idea on harnessing age diversity. And so we're trying to really catch some momentum here with people like yourselves around the idea that there are challenges inherent here that we can hopefully neutralize, but then there are opportunities that we can leverage. So for my section today, before Heather and I begin our discussion, I want to talk a little bit about the challenges that we find through research in multi-generational teams. So if you have found that it is frustrating or conflict-ridden to work with people older or younger than yourselves, you are right. So research would support that if we don't have a good strategy here, we are going to end up with things like miscommunication and conflict, just like any other kind of diversity. But when we talk about multi-age and multi-generational teams, and I use those terms pretty interchangeably, I want to just quickly mention a few challenges that you may have experienced. And this is just to acknowledge that this is complicated. This isn't about stereotyping people. It's not about right or wrong. It's about the real human dynamics that come from different levels of experience and perspectives and norms. So a few that we dug into in our book, first of all, the power struggle. So I want you to think about this around clout. Who is in charge? And most team struggles are about either informal or formal definitions of power, decision-making. Traditionally, if you grew up at a time when the higher up you were on the org chart, the more right you had to make decisions. That can be jarring when younger generations may come in with a different set of norms, that it's the person who has, the most relevant experience on the topic, or that age shouldn't matter in terms of decision making. If you have the credibility, you should be allowed to weigh in, and all of those things that go back to the fact that there's sometimes an inherent power struggle, and who gets to weigh in, who gets to have input versus who gets to make decisions. Those things can all be percolating and be really challenging. Balancing team needs, particularly as a leader, can be very tricky when it comes to all of those different layers of who we are. So generations may have different norms. So I like to talk a lot when I speak to organizations about the fact that we all have the same needs. And Heather and I talked about this on an earlier call this week. Research would support that it doesn't matter what age you are. We all need to feel respected. We need to feel connected. We need to have some agency or autonomy. But when we mix in things like generation, career stage, tenure, we start to get some complicating factors around what we need at that particular time and whose needs should be prioritized. So I just recently wrote a piece about Gen Z and the fact that while we all need connection in the workplace, Gen Z has started their careers in a remote environment. For the most part, the oldest Gen Zs are 25. And so early in your career, you need a lot of connection, networking, you're building your professional identity. And so that connection actually has more salience, and it can be really challenging to be working in a hybrid or remote environment, leading to some of that quiet quitting trend that we're seeing. So that's just an example of how age, generation, career stage can all make balancing those team needs a little bit tricky. So decision-making, I did some great sessions the last few months about who gets to vote, who gets to have input. Should everyone have equal say in a team, or is there still a need for things like tenure-based authority and decision-making in teams? And those are things that need to be discussed. And then what I always say, a little thing that ends up often being the biggest thing are these clashing communication norms. And we did some case studies in the book where we interviewed multi-age teams where the biggest issues they were having was around their communication channels. So for example, we talked to a team that had college students, people in their 30s, and then some older adults who were retired and coming back to be on this team to act as coaches and mentors. And the biggest significant challenge they were having was that the younger people were often texting as their preferred form of communication, and they were often texting, quote, off hours, so early evening. And often those texts were not being responded to by older members of the team in this particular case. And that was causing some resentment and frustration from the younger members. And then when we talked with the older members, they remarked that, they didn't believe text was appropriate for work, that they saved texts for friends and family. And they didn't also think those were things that needed to be communicated off work hours. So those were just different norms. We've also seen this with organizations trying to use things like Slack, or really holding strong to things like phone calls or face-to-face, or even challenges around email. So those can often be things that don't seem like a big deal that end up being significant in terms of productivity and engagement. And then finally, knowledge judgment. So one of the key things we found in our work is that we have some level of threat around working with people who are of different generations or substantially older or younger than we are. And this is because we have normalized in our workplace and our society that we are somehow in generational competition. And this is, of course, largely due to the media, due to clickbait articles, and this perception that we're somehow in battle for whether it's opportunities or relevance. So we found some really great insight about the idea that, if so I'm 45, I'm Heather, that woman with the flowered cardigan and the flower in her hair and that thing you shared, that's me. And we found that, when we think about, for example, if digital knowledge, which is something any generation or age is very capable of learning, but if that is perceived as extremely valuable to my organization, and it's a kind of native learning that younger generations just know growing up, that I have to put some more effort into learning, maybe I find that threatening. If what they know how to do so naturally is valued, does that mean what I know how to do and my expertise is now less valuable? And it's really hard to step away from that sort of threat that comes from those kinds of knowledge relevance. So I want to move to, I saw a comment pop up in the chat about, well, what are we supposed to do about it? Which is why we're here. That's a great question. So I wanted to bring in a model that we created in our work. I love a good trifecta. So we called us the Gentelligent Team Trifecta, and it really does pull from best practices in high performing teams with an eye to what does this mean across ages. So you'll see here that any effective team needs to make sure it's representing in all three areas of the structure, support, and significance. So let me just go through quickly what those are. And in terms of the practical tools, I want you to leave here having some questions that you can go back and honestly discuss with your team. So whether you do this through a Google form, whether you do it in a face-to-face or a lunch and learn, really take an honest look on how all members of your team, all different ages, would respond to these questions. So first of all, the importance of structure in teams. So we know through lots of work that's been done on teams that there are important structure pieces around what are our norms, how are we going to work, and do we all agree that that makes sense? So this is where we have to really step away from the fact that it's not my norms and your norms as older and younger people on a team. We all have our preferences. One of my favorite quotes is that, every generation learns the norms they need to be successful in their own time, right? It's not right or wrong. It's what you've learned you need to do in order to be successful at the time you start your career. And there's some differences there that can be difficult. So these are some key questions that I always encourage teams to discuss. So let's just go back to something like communication channels. What form are we going to use? I'm currently having this ongoing debate with my students here at the university. Are we using Slack or not, right? And if we are using it, why are we using it? Because it was not my favorite thing to learn, but if I understand why we're using it and how it's better than what we were doing before, I am more than capable of learning that. But I would like a good explanation, not just use the latest tool versus another way of communicating. Why do I sometimes want to have face-to-face meetings, or why is it important for us to meet or communicate in other ways? So instead of saying, because we've always done it that way, or everyone's doing it this way, let's talk about our way as a team that makes sense for our goals and what we're trying to accomplish, which might be a little bit of what I would prefer and a little bit of what you would prefer. But what are our norms? And then also we talk a lot about decision-making. So a big light bulb moment I had when talking at a big hospital a couple of months ago was the younger people really were eager to give input and be at the table for important conversations that I think in prior years would have been reserved for the more senior people at the organization. And there was a lot of concern about confidentiality, transparency from both sides. And we finally figured out that the younger people really wanted to hear what was going on, and they wanted to have the opportunity to give input, but they didn't have an expectation that they were necessarily going to be making decisions. So this conversation we unpacked around the difference between who gets to have input and be heard versus who technically needs to make the final decision was a really important one that I think cleared up a lot of tension. So these are some structure questions to keep an eye on. I'm going to go next to this goes really fast. Support, the second one. So this, I saw somebody put psychological safety in the chat. We talk a lot about that in our book. Many of you are very familiar with psychological safety. Heather mentioned it. It's also in the guide. And this is the idea that every single person, regardless of age, wants to feel that they are adding unique value at work and they are appreciated for who they are. And of course, age is part, but not a significant, always piece of that. But if it's ignored or people feel devalued because of their older age or their younger age or their in-between age, that's a big deal. So we specifically talk about this concept of, are we willing to share our best ideas? And usually the older we are, the more we feel we've sort of earned the right to share those ideas. So younger people may or may not feel, I've heard from a lot of students and former students that they're not sure they should or can share an idea or perspective because they're worried they're going to get saddled with that entitlement label that we are so quick to use. And then on the flip side, do we feel like we can ask for help? Which is another important part of psychological safety. And I've actually seen this be a bigger challenge for my older colleagues. So when we all went to lockdown and had to be ready to teach on Zoom in 5 minutes, like everyone had that same experience with their work, I scrambled and did my best. And I went ahead and asked all of my students, I said, I'm going to need your help because I've done the best I can. I think I did pretty well. Like I'm hip that way, but I'm sure there's things I'm not going to know how to handle. And I'd like us all to be able to figure it out together. So I'm going to ask that I be able to lean on you for help when necessary, because that's something that's somewhat more natural for them. And I love I've learned so much working with young people every day. And I had an older colleague, so he's about 15 years older than me. I've worked with him for almost 20 years. And he called me to talk about Zoom. And I said, well, happy to get you set up, but always feel free to ask your students if you run into a problem while you're teaching. And he said, he was horrified. He said, I could never ask my students for help. They wouldn't respect me. And that's a big misperception in all kinds of leadership, that asking for help makes you seem less capable or less respected, as many of you know, and this is particularly true across ages. So I'd be really interested in how your team members would respond if you ask those questions around how comfortable they are in both sharing ideas and asking for help. And we have some strategies and tools in the book about ways to normalize this, how to create norms and mutual mentoring opportunities where people are offering up things that they are happy to teach others regardless of age, and things that they would love to learn. All right, so the next one here, this has like a really, All right, we're going to go back, way back. There we go. All right. The last part of the trifecta here is what we call significance. And this is really the fact that, of course, we all need to feel like the work we're doing has purpose and meaning. And it doesn't matter if you just started your career or you are well into your career. Do I feel like I'm adding unique value, that my perspective matters? And do I feel like working on this team, I'm helping create something bigger than myself? And are we as a team creating norms where what we want are the best ideas, and that together we're going to figure out how to help make them happen? So my favorite question in my tool here before I get ready to turn it back over to Heather is, once we're focused on our shared team mission and our shared team goal, it becomes a lot more comfortable to then back away and be open to different ways of approaching something. So think about older manager saying to a younger team member, okay, now that you understand our mission as a team, I'd really love to hear how you would approach this. And then the listening. And what happens, I've seen this happen over and over again, is when they're asked for input, they feel respected, they feel valued, they feel significant. They'll share tons of ideas. Some of them are going to be new and innovative and great. Some of them will be not what we need, or something that we're pretty sure isn't going to work. But there's going to be something great in there. And then what happens is, once someone's been invited to give their input, you as an older leader can say, well, okay, I really love this one. I have some questions. And you can lead them through your feedback, your mentorship, shaping the ideas, your insights, not lecturing, but your insights on how maybe we would have to move forward to really make that idea a reality in a practical sense. And then if you think as a younger manager leading people who are older, so 40% of people report to someone older, or excuse me, younger than them. A younger leader saying to older team members, here's our goal. I really love to hear how you would do it. You're respecting their expertise and experience, and you want to hear all that wisdom that they've gained. And then, of course, they're going to be much more likely to be interested in your input and feedback as well. So it works both ways. And that's just a really key important part of the team dynamic that we often lose because we assume in a multi-age team that we're going to figure it out. And we often have to be more intentional and proactive about it. All right, so finally, is it worth all the work? The research would suggest yes, and this is very aligned with what Heather shared with us earlier, so I won't spend too much time on it. But we're tapping into different informational networks. We're doing a much better job attracting the best talent across every age group, and then really relevant today, retaining that talent. So as the longevity of people increases, they will want to stay in the workforce longer, and we can really support that happening if we continue to engage our older workers in these ways. And don't assume that they're going to be retiring soon and start sort of disengaging them ourselves, but also the innovation and adaptation that we need for the future of work really inherent in these multi-generational teams. All right, so we know how important it is. Very few organizations are ready for it. I certainly hope yours are, and I think you being here today is a great testament to that. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Heather for our discussion.
Great, thanks, Megan. It is fantastic. I just learned so much, even just, I mean, every time we've talked, I've learned more from you. So I'm just really enjoying continuing to sort of get your insights. I want to invite people to put your questions in the Q&A tool or the chat. We would love to hear your questions for us. To kick things off, though, Megan, I want to sort of address something that I wrestle with back and forth, and that is the concept of generations. Okay, so we have these labels that we put on folks: Gen Z, Gen X, and so on, boomers, millennials, greatest generation. And I did this exercise once where I typed in to Google, Google the font of all wisdom, right? Why are boomers ... Why are millennials ... And every single generation except for Gen X, the notion of I know people forget about us, but no, but for every generation except Gen X, the term entitled came up. So why are millennials so entitled? Why are Generation Z so entitled? Why are boomers so entitled? So it's clear that, these are really stereotypes that adhere to, probably driven by sort of media and clickbait, as you mentioned. On the other hand, you raise a really good point. If you came up in the workforce in, when you're a boomer, you're joining the workforce much earlier than when I did, or our younger colleagues did, you have different norms that you absorbed. And maybe those norms haven't changed in your brain. So age impacts, and yet generations is it really just hokum?
Yeah, a great question. And it's really a bit of a fire keg. People get kind of feisty about whether generational identity or generations should exist. And every couple of years, I'll see an article about like an end to generations. I actually I've written on this because I feel really passionately that generations are a fantastic layer of your identity. I think when people say that they want to get rid of generations, what they really mean is they want to get rid of generational stereotypes, which I'm a big fan of. I'm in favor of getting rid of generational stereotypes. They're very lazy. And they're like any other stereotypes you would have. If you typed in "why are women ... right, you would get similar things, and men, and all of those, different kinds of difference. But the reason that I'm a big advocate and champion for all generations is it's not that different than talking about someone's political party or their religion, is that we're not saying everyone within this social category is the same. That's ignorant. what we're saying and how it should be used is as a lens to understanding why they may have certain norms, why they define success in a particular way, where their attitudes about work or learning or risk or any of those things, how they might have been shaped in a way that's different than your own. So I stole this from a friend of mine who works in diversity and inclusion, but what I love to say is that when you're talking about generations, and I would also argue age, you should paint a backdrop and then it should be a comma. So I'm a Gen Xer, comma, and here's all the 20 other things about me that matter. You're right, like as you talked about. So this, and someone had a question in the chat about intersectionality. So I think about generations as a layer of identity, and age is there, life stage, gender, socioeconomic status, culture, you name it. Like we can layer all those things. They interact. It's complex. It's interesting. It's important. But to assume that my students who are entering work right now are having the same experience or inherently have the same kind of expertise I did when I entered the workforce is not productive, because it's not true. Where we have to be careful is to not stereotype, to not assume that we are entirely different because we're of different generations. We have those inherent similar needs. But I think we think about it as the problem we get into is when we use those categories as insults. So, okay, boomer or Gen X slacker, entitled millennial, we wouldn't tolerate that with any other kind of difference.
Right.
And yet we as society have normalized age as well as generation being something that is acceptable to joke about, or we don't even blink an eye. And in those clickbait headlines, of course, feed that. And that's one of the things when I wrote for NBC, my first article, I didn't realize I didn't get to title my own article. They title it what they think is going to get the most clicks. And so I've written, I don't know, 6 or something for NBC. And I always try to write something very balanced that gives credit to different generations. And I never know when I wake up, when it goes to press, what it's going to be. And it's often something designed to clickbait, like it's designed to get clicks. And that makes it often polarizing or, a little bit more stereotypical than I would prefer. So I'm going to stay firm on the side that generational identity is interesting and important and fantastic when it's used as a source of diversity of thought, not a source of insult.
Yeah, and you mentioned that clickbait kind of thing. We did a video a couple of years ago here at AARP called "For Her Age," and it was asking people to fill in the blank. She looks blank for her age, like she looks great for her age. She looks amazing for her age. Her skin is flawless for her age, right? And so, but then like we wouldn't say something like, she drives well for an Asian person. That's horrifying. That would be horrifying, right? And so, why is age acceptable as like a thing that can even sort of masquerade as a compliment? Oh, like you look great for your age, but you don't look great in general, but for your age, you look great, right? So it's really sort of insidious. It's really in the culture. I want to get to some questions in the Q&A. Alfred asks, are some sectors or types of organizations more problematic than others? I think this is an interesting.
I'm sure you have seen quite a bit of this. I mean, I'm immediately going to go to the tech sector if we're going to talk about particularly the problem against older workers. So lots of public information around lawsuits. It's really amazing things, especially when internal memos become public. And I think we see a lot of ageism dressed up as something else. That fit word, you're just not a good fit here. And I think tech is probably the worst offender because of the perception that older people don't like technology or can't use technology. And there's not any good research showing that that's true. I think it's kind of fascinating, though. There is research showing that older people have different preferences around how much technology or how often they use technology or what they use technology for. It's a bit more intentional rather than pervasive. And that's because we haven't always used it as our go-to for everything. we have learned it as we went along, and we're just as capable as anyone else to learn it. So I think those stereotypes hit the hardest in tech. That's where I've seen it the most. And then in terms of the other side of the coin, I think where we have the highest mean age of employees is in the skilled trades. So my husband's a contractor and he's 46, and he's almost always the youngest person on any job site. So I actually think that's going to be an opportunity, because so many young people are now being wooed into the skilled trades because of all the opportunities. So rather than incur student loan debt, we're seeing apprenticeships come back and things like that.
Yeah, and I know that's true of the manufacturing industry as well. The sort of average age is a little higher than the average age of the regular sort of workforce. So, and I also know that in ad agencies, media, creative agencies, there tends to be a lot of ageism. People, I've been to conferences in, industry conferences, and they'll folks just chatting with folks there, they talk about how they have to have an exit strategy at like 35, 37, 38, because by 40, they're like sort of pushed out or, passed over or kind of managed out. So yeah, there are some industries where it's more, but hopefully that conversation is changing. I'm going to see here if there's other stuff in the chat. How can the public sector, this is from George, how can the public sector adopt DEI in the workforce, being the largest employer? The federal government is here in DC where I am, and they're the biggest employer. And so that is a great question. How, is it easier in for-profit, or for-profit more nimble or not?
It's a tough question. I will say I've been asked to do some work with some aspects of some parts of the government. And so I can give some positive affirmation that there's certainly an openness in certain pockets to it. I think the reality is, much of our government is a bureaucracy. I don't think that's a secret. And in any kind of bureaucracy or bureaucratic structure, change takes a lot longer. One of the things that is sort of fascinating is when bureaucracy was first created, it made things so much more efficient because we didn't have any structure at all. Well, now fast forward 100+ years, we associate it with very slow change. And I think there tends to be a rigidity where we do things this way because we've always done them this way. And so that makes it harder to maybe think differently about these things. A lot of things like decision-making is controlled by how long you've been somewhere. And so it's hard to change things when we're very adherent to rules and regulations. So I do think, though, positioning it, the government and public companies have very strong DE&I responsibilities, not just Age Discrimination Act, but I think positioning this as a key part of DE&I. We've talked a lot, in your work speaks to this a lot, how age needs to be, it's part of the Civil Rights Act, it's part of a lot of state, as you said, protection for both old and young. So I think the more that it can be entered into that DE&I conversation, I think regardless of sector, we're going to start seeing more attention to it.
Yeah. And just as a note, I know we had this question in the Q&A tool. DEI stands for diversity, equity, and inclusion. So we're talking about age as an aspect of that. And then in the chat, we had another question. Is the current environment and the need for people in seats alleviating some of this ageism in both directions, young and old? And I honestly think it is helping. I don't know if it alleviates sort of ageism as an acceptable prejudice that still sort of runs through, it runs through the media. It's like, I remember my 5-year-old watching this ridiculous show about trains, they're like old Puffer Pete, who's like creaky and cranky and has to wear glasses. It's just, it starts young, right? That we have these stereotypes. However, I know from talking to DEI leaders, we've been conducting some in-depth interviews over the past couple of weeks, and the shortage of labor is starting to drive more awareness of the need for recruiting across all ages, retaining folks of all ages. So I do think it is changing the conversation. And Megan, I know you talk to folks all the time too, so wondering if you have any insights here.
I think it's a little bit of a double-edged sword. I have seen, and maybe it's just the algorithm on my social media, but I have seen a lot more discussion because we had a lot of our older workers either displaced or seeking new opportunities, intentionally post-COVID, that ageism in the hiring process is really being talked about at a higher level, which I think is great that it's being talked about, that we're raising awareness of it. But really people feeling like their age is being looked at in a either blatantly ageist way, so they're getting illegal questions, or in a more subtle way about asking about, well, what year did you graduate from college? These ways that are seeping in. And so I've seen increased frustration from older workers wanting to make proactive moves or needing new opportunities and feeling like the attitude is, well, we don't want to hire someone, quote, that close to retirement, which I don't even know what that means these days. People are having second, third act careers, and it's a pretty ignorant strategy for companies. I mean, our older workforce is probably one of our most substantial opportunities in terms of wanting to work, being, very well qualified to work, bringing many more decades of productivity for companies that look at that labor pool as being an asset. So I think the ageism aspect of people getting back out there into the workplace is not pretty. But I also think the rules change after crisis. I teach change management. And so we had a crisis, we have some chaos as we try to rebalance and figure out what to do. But now I'm hoping we're going to get a new restructuring of understanding that we got to tap into all of this talent, that we need to step away from maybe the ways that we were thinking about it before. So.
Yeah, and speaking of tapping into talent, somebody mentioned this in the chat as well, that upskilling is a really vital part of leveraging all workers. And we, at AARP, we want to make sure that older workers are not left out of that upskilling conversation. The half-life of skills continues to deteriorate.
Mm-hmm.
Everybody's kind of needs to reskill no matter what their age is. And so I wanted to go back to your observation that this. Your older colleague thought asking for help would diminish his respect, like people would not respect him. And yet I think there needs to be a wider conversation around this idea that we will all be novices repeatedly throughout our working careers, because we'll have multiple careers, and we'll have to sort of return to the drawing board a little bit, or we're just going to need to upskill. Mm-hmm. So do you have any tips for employers with regard to approaching upskilling in an age inclusive manner?
I do. I think that was something really fascinating. So we found that some trends there around younger employees believed they would need to reskill. They believed it was their responsibility to continue to get the training and upskilling that they were going to need to stay relevant. Older generations felt like if they needed that reskilling or upskilling, it was their employer's responsibility to give it to them. So there was some differences in who should be in charge of deciding you need the training, or whose responsibility that was. So that was kind of interesting. And then I think from an employer perspective, there's sometimes an assumption that older workers will find it insulting if they're asked to train or participate in training. I was actually on a call that had nothing to do with Gentelligence or age diversity with a client, and they made a comment like, well, we're going to roll that out, but probably not for the baby boomers. And of course, I'm like throwing flags left and right. I said, what is that about? And they said, well,
right.
I was talking to Jan and she said she made some comment about how she hoped she didn't have to do that training. And I was like, well, we're not going to make our training decisions based on Jan in the coffee room. Like, that's a one person. Everyone needs to be given that opportunity. Don't assume that somebody doesn't want it because they've been here a while, because that's how you get people to feel disengaged, where they're not being invested in, they're not being given opportunities. But I do think the other side of that is normalizing that, of course, we're all going to keep learning, and asking you to continue training isn't because we think you're not relevant, or you think that, it's because we all need to be doing that. And so there is a big, and this is where those generational norms, I think, really do matter, is that the norm used to be in leadership that if you were the leader, you were assumed to need to know everything. And if you didn't, you better pretend you do and go figure it out. Otherwise, you're not going to be seen as competent. That norm has shifted, and it is seen as more socially acceptable by younger people to say, hey guys, can somebody help me out with this? Or I'm not sure how to do this. Or does anyone know? There's a norm that has gradually moved on the fact that you aren't expected to have everything figured out. As the leader, you're expected to empower your team to help you figure it out, or to step in and help. And so I think that is a norm that used to be very prevalent, that you didn't want to show any kind of vulnerability, or that might be perceived as weakness. And so there is some things that we're up against in terms of offering that training, or suggesting that might benefit everyone, to people who feel like they should be done with that phase. But I think that a lot more people than we expect would love the opportunity. There's some really fascinating stats about how older people will report that they've had no training and development opportunities for the last decade, because it's assumed they don't need them or want them. And we need to not make those assumptions.
Yeah. And I think that that's a real important thing for managers of mixed age teams to keep in mind, is that you want to be agnostic. If training opportunities come your way for your team, you want everybody on the team to have those opportunities. And when you talk with when you're setting your norms, as you mentioned in the structure part of your trifecta, that we assume that everyone can learn. We assume that everyone, I love that your phrase, everyone can teach and everyone can learn. And so if you can bake that into your team norms, that's a great way of helping to be more age inclusive in your management practices. I'm just going to quickly check the chat. I know we're really at time. Looks like there's no new questions. There's a question about sending out the presentation, which we certainly will do, and the recording. But in the meantime, I want to say thank you again, Megan. It's always such a joy to talk to you. Definitely take a look at Megan's book. Check out our employer-focused resources at aarp.org/employers. Feel free to send us your comments, questions, feedback, and topics you would like us to cover in future events. And don't hesitate to connect with us, with Megan and with me, on all the socials. So thank you again, everyone. Take care and be well.
Thank you.
Bye.